Good evening, Dr. Woodall. This is David Franklin. I'm going to be discussing the exegetical issues of my paper on 1 Corinthians 7:25 through 31. I'd like to begin with my interpretation of this passage, my translation. Now concerning those yet to be married, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who has been shown mercy by the Lord to be trustworthy. Therefore I think it is good on the account of the present hardship that a person remain as he or she is. Are you bound to a woman? Do not seek to be loosed. Are you loosed from a woman? Do not seek a woman. But if you marry, you do not sin. And if a betrothed woman becomes married, she does not sin. But those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you such. And I say this, and this I say, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short, for what time remains, that even those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who are acquiring possessions as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present nature of this world is passing away. So, dealing with this passage, there's so much to talk about within these 6 verses, so many exegetical issues, and there's just a couple that I'd like to highlight, and just the significance of them. First thing we see in verse 25 is the phrase peride. This is a common phrase within 1 Corinthians. Paul begins using this phrase in chapter 7, verse 1, and then uses it again in verse 25, and then several times afterwards in 8:1, 12:1, 16:1, and 16 verse 12. And every time he uses this, it refers back to a question that the Corinthian church had asked him in a previous letter. But what's interesting about verse 25 is that Paul is, and he states this plainly, that he's not teaching them or giving them a word from the Lord. It's actually insight from his own wisdom, and we see this when he says in the Greek genomen de didomi. He's saying that this is something that I have prayed about, and this is pastoral advice from the Apostle Paul. So it's not based upon his boasting of his wisdom, but it's focused and founded upon the Lord's grace in his life. I know that I read one commentary that talked about that it was just his selfishness, but I don't think that shows any merit. Another thing that I'd like to point your attention to is in verse 25, Paul uses the word parthenon. Now, what does he mean by this word virgin? I've read several commentaries that have different understandings and interpretations of this word parthenon. Some commentaries refer to the virgins being referred to here as only celibate men. Others will say that this is referring to single individuals who have not been married more than once. Other commentators believe that this refers to married couples that have yet to consummate their marriage. So there's a lot of different opinions, but one that I have really settled with is Douglas Fee's interpretation. He talks about betrothed men and women, that this is the engagement period before they actually consummate their marriage and become husband and wife. I think this is really important to the context of the passage, because as we will see further on, Paul continues to talk about betrothed individuals. In verse 26, there's an interesting prepositional phrase. It's a dia plus the accusative. It's dia tein enestoson. Now, this can be interpreted in 2 ways. It can be interpreted as a casual preposition or a spatial preposition. Now, a spatial preposition refers to a region or a specific area, and Paul is really here talking more about a time period. And so I really believe that this is more or less a casual preposition. But the thing is, when it's talking about distress, present distress, is it future or is it in the present? I think if we look at the context in verse 28, we see that Paul is talking about the future distress in verse 28. But in verse 26, he's much more concerned about the virgins in the present, the betrothed individuals in the present, and I think he's highlighting something more than just what they're going on. I think he's talking more or less about the present distress in the church, and going back into chapters 5 and 6, and just talking about the current sin and immorality that has been plaguing this church. Not only immorality, but immaturity within the church. And this is something that Charles Hodge really points to. And I really appreciate his insight, just because he sums up and culminates what had been going on in the last couple chapters. And that's why Paul is saying the present distress, just the current state of the church. As we continue down in verse 26, we want to look at the haughty conjunction here in this passage, and just asking the question to ourselves: what kind of conjunction is this? Is this a result conjunction or an epi-exegetical conjunction? If we look at it as a result conjunction, it really focuses on the end meaning, or the outcome. And as in the phrase "remain as you are," does Paul focus and emphasize "remain as you are," or if we take it to mean an epi-exegetical conjunction, it really goes back to the initial statement, emphasizing what Paul is saying: it is good for you to remain as you are. So I really interpret this. I mean, it can go either way. But I like to emphasize Paul saying it is good, and just the goodness of the single state. So that's kind of how I've interpreted that, but really it could go either way as a result or epi-exegetical conjunction. In verse 27, something that stands out to me here is the understanding of lusin or lelusai, and whether Paul is meaning divorce of a married couple, or he's talking about being separated from a betrothal engagement period. I think this really boils down to your understanding of gunaiki. Is Paul talking about, is he referring to a wife or a woman? And this can be used interchangeably in Greek. And so I think that that this passage really focuses on the betrothal. And if we interpret gunaiki as woman, I think it fits into the context a lot better, because in verse 28, Paul starts out his sentence saying, this verse saying, if you do get married, not you who are married. So the context of that, along with verse 26, in verse 26, Paul is urging the Corinthians to remain as they are. And so if we translate gunaiki as woman, we understand lusin and lelusai as being loosed rather than separated and divorced. Verse 28, interesting, says oi to toiuti, but those or such who marry. Really interesting here. Is he talking about just those in the future who decide to get married, the betrothed, or is Paul discussing in this section here? Is he saying including all marriages, those that are married in the present and in the future? And Leon Morris contends that oi to toiuti should be interpreted to include all cases, not simply just virgins or the betrothed. And I really tend to agree with Leon Morris in this respect. That Paul is not specifying just that only virgins in the future will encounter worldly troubles, but that he's broadening the scope to include subjects that are married and will become married in the future. Also, really cool, interesting point when we look at in verse 29, Paul uses the word kairos. It's really fascinating study. Why did he use kairos instead of chronos? And there's two, I mean, they both mean time, but it's really interesting because chronos really is more qualitative, to indicate like a measurable duration, while kairos is more applied to the text, and it's used in the New Testament 69 times, and it usually describes a qualitative noun referring to an appointed time. And that's what we see here in verse 29. That Paul is really talking about, that time is short, that the quality of time, the quality of time is short. And then he explains that in verses 29 through 31, that the world is passing away. I think he's really given a sense of urgency here, and we see bits and pieces of like the philosophy that maybe the Corinthians had encountered during that time. But the present active indicative of passing away is really important, because Paul is very much stating that like it's progressive, and so there's a sense of urgency now, focusing their hearts and their minds upon the Lord rather than what the world has to offer. And so this is a little bit over 10 minutes, but thank you so much for this class. I've learned so much, and I really appreciate all that you've taught, and just going through the hardships that you have, and I greatly appreciate your insight, Dr. Woodall. So I'd love to hear more insight, and I pray that you have a Merry Christmas and enjoy time with your family. All right, bye.